Around the year 197 in Carthage, a Roman-trained lawyer named Tertullian wrote a legal defense of Christians and addressed it straight to the magistrates of the empire. Then he did something a working lawyer only does when he is certain of his ground. He told them the event was sitting in their own paperwork and dared them to go pull the file. Why would a man pleading in front of Roman officials point them at an imperial archive he could not control? What did he think was in there? His line survives word for word, and it was a reckless thing to say, given what the earliest documents actually claim. The timing is what gets you first. It is unusually precise for an ancient document. Mark writes that the crucifixion began at the 3rd hour. Hours were counted from sunrise in both Roman and Jewish daytime reckoning, so the 3rd hour is roughly 9 in the morning. Then, at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land and stayed until the 9th hour, noon to 3 in the afternoon. Matthew gives the same window. Luke gives the same window. 3 texts, 1 3-hour block, bracketed on both ends by an exact hour. Here is what is strange. None of the 3 writers stops to explain it. No angel, no voice from the sky, no interpretation, no sermon attached. The darkness arrives, sits there for 3 hours, and lifts. Luke adds one clause that the sun's light failed and moves straight on. For authors supposedly building a case that is oddly flat writing, it reads less like a miracle being sold and more like a detail somebody could not leave out because too many people in Jerusalem that week had stood in it. If a 3-hour blackout really rolled over a Roman province at noon, somebody outside that circle should have written it down. That is the question this whole story turns on. The Roman world was not a world of vague memory. It was a world of clerks. So, the honest test is simple. Go outside the Christian sources, entirely into pagan chronicles, into the imperial paperwork, and see whether anything written in the 1st or 2nd century mentions a day that turned into night. A darkened sun at noon was not a curiosity in this empire. It was state business. In the year 33, Tiberius was emperor, mostly ruling from the island of Capri. Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea, a mid-level administrator whose entire job was keeping a difficult province quiet and reporting upward. Rome ran on written returns. Governors filed dispatches. The capital posted a daily gazette, the Acta Diurna, whitewashed onto boards and read aloud in public. And portents, comets, tremors, freak weather, blood-colored skies were logged obsessively because Roman politics treated the sky as a political instrument. Which brings us to a man named Phlegon of Tralles, a freedman inside the household of the emperor Hadrian. That matters more than it sounds. Phlegon was Greek, from a city in what is now western Turkey, and a freedman in an imperial household had access to libraries, to archives, to records ordinary provincials never touched. Around the year 137, he compiled a chronicle called the Olympiads, 16 books running through the Greek games year by year, logging wars, disasters, freak events, dry work, a ledger of the world. And in that ledger, Phlegon wrote this. In the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was an eclipse of the sun greater than any known before. At the 6th hour the day turned into dark night, so that the stars were seen in the sky. And an earthquake in Bithynia threw down many buildings in the city of Nicaea. Read that again. The 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad lands on the year 33. The 6th hour is noon. The stars were seen. Now, before anyone runs ahead of this, we do not have Phlegon's book. Not one complete copy. What survives is that passage quoted by later writers, by Origen, arguing with a pagan critic in the middle of the 3rd century, and by Eusebius, whose chronicle preserves the wording. Everything hangs on a quotation of a quotation. That is normal for ancient history. Most of what we know about Rome survives exactly that way, but you should know precisely what you are holding. And it gets stranger, because Phlegon was not the only pagan name in play. The second name is Thallus. Around the year 221, a Christian scholar called Julius Africanus was writing a world history, and when he reaches the darkness he says this: Thallus, in the third book of his histories, calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun. Thallus was not a believer, he was a chronicler. And what Africanus reports him doing is the interesting part. He does not say the darkness never happened. He does not call it a rumor. He reaches for a natural explanation, which means, to him, the event needed explaining. Then Africanus does something you would not expect from a 3rd century writer. He checks the astronomy. His objection, roughly: how are we to believe an eclipse happened when the moon was diametrically opposite the sun? Thallus cannot be right, and he is saying it on physical grounds. 18. A Christian historian arguing hard against the one explanation that would have made his own story easier to defend. So let's take his objection seriously and run it properly. A solar eclipse needs the moon between us and the sun. That only happens at new moon when the lit face is turned away and the moon is invisible from the ground. Passover is fixed to the 14th of Nisan, and the Jewish calendar is lunar. The 14th of Nisan is a full moon every single year, which puts the moon on the far side of the earth from the sun, rising as the sun goes down. So on that specific date, in that specific week, a solar eclipse is not unlikely, it is geometrically impossible. Then there is the clock. The absolute theoretical maximum for totality is about 7.5 minutes, and real eclipses almost never come close, most run 2 to 5. The reason is speed. The moon's shadow is a small, dark oval racing across the Earth's surface at more than 1,700 kilometers an hour. It cannot park. 3 hours is 180 minutes, roughly 24 times the longest total eclipse physics will permit. To get 3 hours of dark out of an eclipse, you would have to stop the moon. And the eclipse tables agree. Run the 5 millennium catalog of solar eclipses backwards, and there is no total solar eclipse crossing Jerusalem in the spring of 33. There is a real one nearby in time, though the 24th of November in the year 29. Totality lasted 1 minute and 59 seconds inside a shadow track a little over 100 kilometers wide, and it swept across northern Anatolia, which is exactly where Bithynia is, exactly where Nicaea is, and here is where this gets uncomfortable for our best witness. Because some scholars argue the number in the text is a copying error, that it should read the first year of that Olympiad, not the 4th. One digit moves Phlegon's entry from 33 back to 29 and lands it squarely on that real Anatolian eclipse. On that reading, Phlegon is not describing Judea at all. He is describing a genuine 2-minute eclipse over his own corner of the world, plus a quake at Nicaea, and later writers stitched it onto a different event in a different province, hundreds of kilometers and several years away. That is the strongest case against the strongest witness. So strip the eclipse out completely. What is left that can dim a sky for 3 hours? The British physicist Colin Humphreys has argued for a Khamsin, the hot sandstorm that blows off the desert into Israel between March and May, hauling so much dust that the sun goes dim and copper-colored for hours at a stretch. Others have floated volcanic ash drifting from a distant eruption or a heavy dark cloud front. All physically possible. All completely ordinary. And none of them recorded anywhere else for that particular spring. But there is one line in the record that none of them comfortably fit. Try to stand in it for a second, not at dusk, not a storm you can watch, coming with a wall of cloud on the horizon, midday light thinning. Birds going quiet, which is what eclipse watchers always report first, that the sound stops before the light does. Temperature dropping, shadows losing their edges. And then people reaching for lamps at what everybody knows is the middle of the day. Inside a city packed for Passover, tens of thousands of pilgrims jammed within the walls, with no way at all to explain what the sky is doing. And then Phlegon's detail. The stars were seen in the sky. That is a very specific claim, and a hard one to produce. In a total eclipse, the brightest planets and a handful of stars do come out. That part is genuinely real, but it takes the sun almost entirely covered. A dust storm dims the sun. It does not usually hand you constellations. Whatever a witness believed they saw over their heads at noon that day, they reached for the most extreme comparison their language had. Night, actual night. Matthew adds an earthquake. And in 2012, 3 geologists, Jefferson Williams, working with Marcus Schwab and Achim Brauer of the German Research Center for Geosciences, published a paper in the International Geology Review on sediment cores pulled from the Dead Sea shore at Ein Gedi. The sediment there lays down annual layers like tree rings so you can count backwards. They found a deformed layer from a seismic event between the years 26 and 36 with a best estimate around the year 31, give or take 5. That window contains the crucifixion. Be careful with that one, though the authors were. They listed the options plainly. The quake Matthew describes, or a quake before or after it that got borrowed by the writer, or a purely local tremor that shook the mud at Ein Gedi and left no other mark on history. There is one more thread. In 1983, in the journal Nature, Colin Humphreys and the astrophysicist Graham Waddington, then at Oxford, argued the crucifixion falls on Friday the 3rd of April, year 33, partly because a partial lunar eclipse rose over Jerusalem that evening, a moon coming up already shadow. The astronomer Bradley Schaefer pushed back hard. By moonrise, the deep phase was finished, and nobody would have noticed. So even the moon is contested. Which brings us back to the man I promised you. Around the year 197, in Carthage, a Roman-trained lawyer named Tertullian wrote a legal defense of Christians addressed straight to the magistrates of the empire. He raises the darkness, the light of day withdrawn while the sun stood at its meridian blaze, and then he does something genuinely reckless. He tells them where to check. His line, "You yourselves have the account of that world, portent still in your archives." Not a vision, not a testimony. A filing reference. He is telling Roman officials to go open their own cabinets and read it. Nobody knows whether they ever did. The archives Tertullian pointed at are gone burned, scattered, rotted through 14 centuries of collapse, and no Roman document describing a 3-hour darkness has ever surfaced. Most historians today read the whole thing as literary, an echo of the prophet Amos, who wrote of a sun going down at noon. Maybe they are right. But it leaves you holding an odd shape. A Greek chronicler dating a noon night to the year 33, a pagan historian reaching for an eclipse that could not have happened, and a lawyer daring the Roman Empire to check its own paperwork. He was that certain the file existed. Somebody, somewhere, wrote down the day the sun went out. We are still looking for the page. That's all for today. If you found this useful, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who'd care. Catch you next time.